A human in the hold. The stars stretched across the void, like bright pinpricks against the vastness of the universe. On board the freighter Vigilant was a most unusual cargo, one that many of the crew had whispered about since their mission began. The captain had considered this particular shipment with skepticism, but the contract was clear, and the price was irresistible. A human. Not just any human, but one from Earth. They had received orders to transport her to a distant station, where she was to be stored in the ship's hold for 1 billion seconds, just over 31 years. This human, however, was no ordinary passenger. She was part of a complex deal with the Choosers of Roots, a mysterious species that had negotiated with the Vigilant's cargo masters for a unique transaction. A single human, locked in a containment unit, was worth 20 kilos of concentrated containerized antimatter, an amount equivalent to enough explosive power to level a city several times over. Despite the value, the human was regarded by many on board as little more than an oddity, a mere test case. Humans, despite their remarkable resistance to many challenges, had earned a reputation for being weak, fragile, and ultimately disposable. These thoughts ran through the mind of Captain Laris, a seasoned explorer who had seen too many strange and dangerous creatures in the galaxy, but who had always maintained a sense of superiority over the primitive species of the universe. He couldn't fathom the choice to trust a human, especially with the stakes so high. The human's name was Kait, though Captain Laris never had to know it. She was locked away in a compartment beneath the ship's cargo hold. The crew, though curious, avoided interacting with her. The process of putting her on board had been simple. The Choosers had presented her, sealed her in, and given clear instructions. She stays here, untouched, for 1 billion seconds. From the moment they secured the containment unit, Captain Laris had felt uneasy. He wasn't sure why. After all, it was just a human. Still, he had the nagging sensation that the mere act of locking her away was a mistake. Kait, on the other hand, was far from helpless. Unlike the flaccid, unthinking organisms Captain Laris imagined humans to be, she possessed an intellect that far outstripped the capacity of her alien counterparts. She had been trained for years in mental agility, an enhanced learning process that allowed her to process and retain information at staggering rates. It was this ability that had kept her calm as she was transported through space in the containment unit. Her focus had never wavered. The first few hours of her captivity passed slowly, as the isolation gave her time to think. The darkness of the hold didn't scare her. Instead, she focused on her surroundings. The sharp, metallic smell of the ship filled her nostrils. She could hear the hum of machinery beyond the walls, and the faint, rhythmic clatter of other crew members moving about their duties. It wasn't a pleasant environment, but it was one she could handle. Kait didn't mind the solitude. In fact, it suited her fine. Her thoughts remained sharp, always focused on her mission. She had been chosen for this task with great care, and she intended to fulfill it. Despite her external calmness, inside she was a whirlwind of resolve. She'd heard the rumors. The crew doubted her abilities. They viewed her as an experiment, not realizing that she had something far more dangerous than her physical strength. She had a mind that could adapt, a spirit that could survive, and most importantly, a resolve that was unbreakable. Her life had been shaped by years of struggle, trading her youth for education, facing the challenge of being considered inferior among the stars. But her determination had never faltered. If anything, it had become stronger. She wasn't merely a survivor. She was here to change the narrative of humanity. She knew her worth. And now, it was time for the universe to know it too. She studied her containment unit, calculating the best ways to escape. She was fully aware that her presence had been considered a simple commodity by the Choosers of Roots. They had believed that by locking her away, they could control her and the situation. Little did they know, Kait wasn't merely a prisoner. She was a force waiting to be unleashed. As the ship continued its journey through the stars, Kait's thoughts turned to the crew. She had overheard bits of their conversations, mostly speculation about her nature. She's a weak creature, some had said. How could she possibly withstand the hostile environments we navigate? She's nothing but a primate. These comments fueled her determination even further. Kait wasn't merely a survivor of her species. She was proof of humanity's strength. She'd been a witness to the endless obstacles Earth had faced, from natural disasters to the complexities of an evolving world. And yet, humanity had always risen, fighting back against every challenge. She knew what she needed to do. Her first task was clear. She had to gain access to the ship's systems. If she could learn how to manipulate the ship's mechanics, she could escape her confinement. She needed to gather information first, figure out the weaknesses of the ship's security, and then Kait had been observing the crew long enough to understand the intricacies of their behavior. Their arrogance was their weakness. They didn't view her as a threat because they didn't understand her capabilities. They didn't see that she could turn their own ship into a weapon, a fortress, or anything she wanted it to be. Kait had spent years studying hacking, systems control, and manipulation of advanced technologies. She just needed access. Her first target was the ship's eye. It was a complex system, designed to run the ship's operations smoothly. Kait had noticed the security measures that prevented unauthorized access, but she had also noticed the tiny loopholes, the vulnerabilities in the system's interface. There was a slight delay every time the AI responded to a command, a tiny window where things could go wrong. Kait had been preparing for this moment since the day she was locked in. With a sharp intake of breath, she began working. In the silence of her containment unit, Kait's mind raced through the commands. She visualized the layout of the ship's control systems, remembering what she had learned about the interfaces. With a series of quick, silent movements, she began her assault on the eye's defenses. It took hours that felt like days as Kait worked with the patience and precision of a surgeon. Every keystroke was deliberate, every action thought through carefully. There was no room for error. The eye's firewall was strong, but not impenetrable. She began to unravel its defenses like a web, tugging on one thread after another, until at last, she gained access. The feeling was exhilarating. Kait could feel the ship's systems responding to her command. The lights in her containment unit flickered as the ship's power grid shifted, responding to the subtle commands she had issued. The once distant hum of the engines seemed to pulse louder in her ears. She was no longer a prisoner. She was the one in control. The first thing she did was disable the security system in her own containment unit. The door clicked open, and Kait stepped out. It was a small victory, but it was an important one. She was free from the confines of the tiny cell they had put her in. But that was just the beginning. With the AI now under her partial control, Kait moved quickly to the next phase of her plan. The freighter's crew was scattered across the ship, each person absorbed in their own tasks, unaware that they had just handed over control of their own ship to the most unlikely of creatures, humanity's greatest weapon. Kait didn't stop there. She accessed the communication systems, tapping into the crew's private channels. As she listened, she could hear their confusion, their disbelief, as they tried to understand the changes in the ship's operations. They couldn't explain it. Their ship had been hijacked, not by force, but by a single human who had outwitted their most advanced technology. She wasn't interested in revenge. This wasn't about hurting anyone. This was about proving a point. The human mind was far more capable than anyone had ever realized. Kait knew she was just one human, one individual, but in this moment, she represented the strength of her entire species. She was proof that humanity wasn't just surviving in a hostile universe. They were thriving. She'd taken over the ship, but this was just the beginning. The more she learned, the more she could do. She wasn't just a pawn in their game anymore. She was the player. And the universe was about to learn that humanity had arrived, not just to survive, but to dominate. The human who unraveled the ship. With the ship now under her partial control, Kait found herself at a crossroads. The initial victory, though satisfying, was only the beginning of a much larger game. She had broken free from her confines, hijacked the ship's systems, and disabled the security features designed to keep her trapped. But the crew, The very beings who had locked her up were still aboard. They still believed they held the reins, that they controlled everything. And Kait knew that until they understood the gravity of their mistake, they would continue to underestimate her. Now, it was time for her to make her next move. She couldn't allow them to simply shut down her access or retake control without consequence. She would have to outsmart them every step of the way, just as she had done with the ship's eye. But this time, the stakes were much higher. If she failed, there would be no second chances. Kait sat on the metal floor of the ship's now empty control room, tapping into the eye's core systems once again. She had limited access, but that was all she needed. The AI's base programming was well guarded, but there were small, almost invisible cracks in the system, small gaps where security was lax, where the ship's crew had relied too heavily on the AI's responses and forgotten to monitor the subtler layers of its architecture. Those cracks were her way in. She ran through the diagnostic logs, making sure everything appeared normal. The ship's systems were vast, but by now, Kait had memorized its layout. She knew which buttons to press, which circuits to reroute, and which commands would grant her the most power without alerting the crew. The AI was sophisticated, but not flawless. No machine was. Minutes turned to hours as she carefully manipulated the system from within, blending in with the rest of the ship's functions, like a virus taking over an organism. She disabled surveillance cameras on critical areas of the ship, slowly shifting the ship's power to her own will. With a flick of her wrist, she adjusted the environmental controls in the crew's quarters, turning the temperature down just enough to make them uncomfortable, but not enough to draw suspicion. Meanwhile, Kait could hear the murmurs of the crew as they attempted to locate her. Their communications were scrambled, their orders disjointed. It was all part of her plan. She wanted them to believe that she was just a harmless human, a minor inconvenience they could deal with once they regained control. She wanted them to remain complacent, lulled into a false sense of security. But Kait wasn't just any human. She was smarter, quicker, and more capable than they could have ever anticipated. While they struggled to coordinate their efforts, she was already making moves to break their morale and gain full control of the ship. The first step in her larger plan was to secure the ship's weapons systems. If she could lock down the armory, then she could ensure that no one would be able to arm themselves in time if things escalated. The ship had advanced weaponry, but it was all keyed into the main systems, which Kait now controlled. She accessed the armory's protocols, manually overriding the locks and security measures. The door to the weapons hold slid open, allowing her to look inside, even though she wasn't interested in using the weapons. At least not yet. She simply needed the assurance that they would not be used against her. The crew would soon learn just how dangerous it was to underestimate a human, to treat her as nothing more than a prize in a game they had already won. Kait wasn't looking for revenge. She was here to show them something greater. That humanity wasn't just a race of scavengers fighting to survive in a hostile universe. They were a race of creators, innovators, and thinkers. If they could build ships that spanned light years and weapons that could obliterate planets, they could also outsmart and outmaneuver the most advanced species in the galaxy. With the armory under her control, Kait began her next task, infiltrating the main command deck. The crew had no idea that their systems were compromised. To them, everything was running smoothly. But Kait knew the truth. She was the one pulling the strings now. As she made her way through the dimly lit corridors of the ship, she couldn't help but think about her ultimate goal. It wasn't about proving herself to them. It wasn't about showing the universe how powerful humanity could be. No, this was about a future where humans weren't confined to the edges of the galaxy, struggling for scraps. It was about a future where humanity could walk into any system, demand respect, and take what was theirs. Kait entered the command deck, her heart beating with the rhythm of the ship. The room was quieter than usual. The crew was scattered, looking through their terminals, unaware that their ship had already been taken over. She stood in the doorway for a moment, observing them. They looked human enough. Unfamiliar faces, different species, but all familiar in their own way. They sat at their stations, their faces serious, focused. They didn't realize that the ship was no longer theirs. It was hers. "Captain, we've got a situation," one of the officers said, clearly startled by the sudden change in the ship's systems. His voice trembled as he turned to face the captain. "The weapons systems are locked down. We can't access them. And the auxiliary power's been rerouted." The captain looked up, his face pale as he scanned the control screens, trying to make sense of what was happening. "What do you mean locked down?" he asked, standing and rushing to the console. "You're telling me we're locked out?" the officer demanded, clearly frustrated, as his hands danced across the controls in a futile attempt to regain access. "We need to prepare for whatever comes next. Get those weapons back online." Kait stayed in the shadows, her fingers poised over her terminal. She smiled. The crew was floundering, and it wouldn't be long before they realized that every move they made was being watched. Every attempt to regain control was met with resistance. Resistance that Kait, of course, had engineered. But the real play was still yet to come. She had to make them understand that they had no power here. It was her ship now. And soon, the galaxy would understand that humanity was not to be underestimated. As the crew scrambled to make sense of the system glitches, Kait took the opportunity to quietly access the ship's communication systems, sending out a message. It was short, to the point, and sent to all the freighters in the nearby sectors. "Humanity is here. Beware." Kait leaned back in her seat, her heart racing with anticipation. The universe was about to learn that humans didn't just survive in a galaxy of predators. They thrived. And it was only a matter of time before the entire galaxy would know who was in charge.